First off, I'd like to say happy anniversary. Thank you for allowing Candace and myself to be your pastors for 11 years. I went yesterday to find a happy anniversary balloon. The only one they had looked like it was heart-shaped. Just didn't work. So I thought a thank you balloon would be good. For 11 years, starting our 12th tomorrow, actually it was 11 years ago today on the 16th of August that I stood in this pulpit for the first time. I asked my wife this question. I said, "Can, what in the world are we doing in Maryland?" Some of you remember that. But I'm just so thankful the Lord led us together to be a part of this church family. And what's really cool is after 11 years, we still like each other. How wonderful is that? So I thank you this morning. I also want to share with you something else that's going to be coming up very quickly here within the next month. I'm actually going to be taking 8 weeks off on a sabbatical. And so for starting about September 10, I'll be off 8 weeks. During that time period, I'll be home most of the time. I had wanted to go to Israel during that time, but maybe not. So I will be home most of the time, taking a few day trips. During that time, Candace will be in charge of the daily affairs, responsibilities of the church. And she'll be, during the 8 weeks I'm off, she'll be preaching about half of those. And we've got some speakers already scheduled for the other half. At this point in time, we have Stuart Pepper. Some of you will know Stuart Pepper, the new principal at HVA. Mr. Hutchinson will be preaching one Sabbath. So we have a bunch of them taken care of. So I just wanted to inform you today so you'll be knowing this. I've been working on this for about 6 months. My goals during the sabbatical, it's not just more vacation days. My goals during sabbatical are professional goals. During the sabbatical, my goal is to read my entire Bible through in 8 weeks. That's 20 Old Testament chapters a day, 5 New Testament chapters a day. When I get to the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, I may speed read a little bit more than that. But my goal at the end of the 8 weeks is to have read the Bible entirely through, to have 100 new sermon ideas, and to have my preaching schedule for the whole next year planned. So I think it's a somewhat aggressive plan, and I think it'll be a real refreshment time for me, which is the point of a sabbatical, to be able to focus on professional growth and enrichment. And I will be here, as I say, in case of emergency. I'll be around. I probably won't be here on Sabbath a lot because if I'm here, I'm not on sabbatical. You'll understand that. But I will be seeing you during that time. So just wanted you to be aware of that because it's coming up within the month. Last week, we talked about 2 brothers, Jacob and Esau. And we talked about how Jacob bartered his ravenous brother Esau out of his birthright. He traded for his birthright a bowl of stew, red lentil stew. Now, red lentil stew, my wife makes a red lentil stew that's really good, but not worth the birthright. So Jacob took advantage of his brother. But what more would you expect from a guy whose name in Hebrew means supplanter, or someone who tries to take the place of someone else? Remember when Jacob and Esau was born, Esau came out first, and Jacob's holding on to his heel, and it's like, hey, get back in here, I want to be the first out. That was Jacob's character. Last week we talked about how Jacob tricked his father into giving him the firstborn blessing. Remember, we talked about how Jacob disguised himself and put on animal skins on his arms because his brother was hairy. And he took Esau's clothes and put them over his clothes so that when Isaac leaned close to hug his son, he smelled like Esau. And that's really what convinced him at the very end. It smelled like Esau. And so he deceived his father. But what else would you expect from a guy whose name means deceiver? The actual name Jacob means someone who tries to take someone else's place, or a deceiver. I'd never really thought about it before preparing for this sermon, how negative the name Jacob is. I mean, would any mother name her child liar? I mean, how far is a child going to get in life with a name like liar? You go in for a job. Are you trustworthy, Mr. Liar? I don't think so. All of his life, he's known as a liar. That's why next week we're going to talk about when his name was changed to Israel. We're going to talk about why that was necessary, because his name meant liar. You know, his nickname was Pants on Fire. It's a negative name, and it haunted him all the days of his life. Well, you can imagine that Esau is angry beyond words at his brother for not only tricking him into giving him his birthright, but also for stealing the blessing that was meant for him. So therefore, Esau begins to make plans. We pick the story up in Genesis 27:41. Genesis 27:41. It says, now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. He knew that as long as his father was alive, he could not kill his brother and get away with it. But when his father was dead, he was laying plans to kill his brother. This is a real threat. Remember who Esau was? He was the hunter. I've got to think he was buff. You know, he was the kind of guy that looked good without a shirt on. He was hairy. His nickname was Hairy, by the way. Esau means hairy. He was an expert at camouflage. He knew how to go through the countryside and hide himself so that he could kill animals. He was an expert with a bow and arrow, perhaps with a sling. He was a warrior. And when a warrior says, I'm going to kill my brother, he can do it. And so he begins to plan. He begins to murmur. Verse 42. But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. I think that's an interesting way to put it. Esau comforts himself. It's like it makes him happy to think about killing his brother. Think of that. And so Rachel has a plan. She had planned for Jacob to get the blessing by lying to his father. Now she has another plan. And this is a lie. She says, now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away. until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you forth from there. Why should I be bereft of both of you in one day?" That would have been both her husband Isaac and her son Jacob. "I don't want to lose you both in one day. So what you have to do is you have to flee." Now, she can't go to Isaac and say, "Jacob needs to run away because Esau's going to kill him." And so what she does is she concocts a story. And she exaggerates a little bit. Verse 46, "Then Rebekah said to Isaac, 'I loathe my life because of the Hittite women.'" Remember, last week we saw Esau had married 2 Hittite women, 2 local Canaanite idolaters. And it said earlier that the 2 of them made Isaac and Rebekah's life miserable. So she says to her husband Isaac, "I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of these Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be?" She says to her husband, who loves her very much, "I'd rather die than have Jacob marry one of these Hittite women." And so she proposes to him that Jacob go to her brother's house. Jacob's uncle Laban goes to his house in Haran, which is about 400 miles away probably. It's a long distance. Beersheba is in the very bottom tip of Israel. Haran is all the way back up, almost to where Abraham came from in the first place, way up into Mesopotamia, a long distance. And so she convinces her husband to send Jacob away so he won't marry any of these Canaanite women, so he can have a good, God-fearing wife. You understand that this is just a story. The real purpose. And you really don't understand this story until you understand that this journey that Jacob takes, he is running for his life. He is scared to death. Understand that. And so she sells him, Rebekah sells Isaac on the idea, and so Isaac calls his son to him and gives him a blessing and says, "Go find a nice wife up in Haran, find a good Jewish woman, and be happy and multiply and have lots of babies and get lots of good stuff." So Isaac sends Jacob away. But you do understand that it's only a ruse. It's a cover story. It's the same kind of cover story that happens every once in a while when a young woman who's about 15 or 16 goes to live with her aunt and uncle in California for 7 months. You know what I mean. And then comes back home. There's more to the story, you understand. Same thing here. There's more to the story. Verse 5 of chapter 28 says, "Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother." And so this is Jacob's uncle to where he's going. Now, this is very different because Jacob travels alone. Normally in a case like this, they would send a bunch of servants, a bunch of cattle, or a bunch of camels. They'd have like a caravan going, like the old-fashioned desert caravan. Think of watching old-fashioned movies. But that's not what happens. Jacob is traveling alone. There are no servants or companions. By the way, if you want to read a really wonderful explanation of this story, go to the book Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 17. And you get lots of fascinating details. Jacob avoids contact with other people. And so, even though there are towns or cities along the way he's traveling, he doesn't go into them. He skirts them. Why? Because he doesn't want anyone to know where he is. He's running for his life. What if his father died overnight? and Esau would bring a whole troop after him. So he avoids contact, so someone can say, oh yeah, I saw him 4 days ago. He went that direction. He went on that road. So he avoids contact so his brother can't trace him. And from the book Patriarchs and Prophets, let me just paint this picture, this paragraph. It says, he feared that he had lost forever the blessing that God had purposed to give him. And Satan was at hand to press temptations upon him. Satan was at hand. He had no visible traveling companions, but there was one who dogged his trail. Satan. And he was continually reminding Jacob that he's a liar. He's a thief. He's a no good. His companion was Satan. But as we'll see in a few minutes, there were some others there too, also unseen. The book Patriarchs and Prophets continues on. The evening of the second day found him far away from his father's tents. He was you see later in the story, he's out at a place called Bethel. And we still know where Bethel was today. It's about 50 miles from Beersheba. So in 2 days, he's traveled about 50 miles. He felt that he was an outcast and knew that all this trouble had been brought upon him by his own wrong course. The darkness of despair pressed upon his soul, and he hardly dared to pray. You know, there's something about trouble you get into because of circumstances. But there's also something about trouble you get into because you brought it on yourself by stupid decisions. And it seems to me that those are the kind of guilt things that come upon us because we know that it's by our own choice, by our own bad choices, that we are indeed in these difficulties. So she continues to write, the darkness of despair pressed upon his soul, and he hardly dared to pray. But he was so utterly lonely that he felt the need of the protection from God as he had never felt it before. With weeping and deep humiliation, he confessed his sin and entreated for some evidence that he was not utterly forsaken. Still, his burdened heart found no relief. He had lost all confidence in himself and feared that the God of his fathers had cast him off. It's in this purple funk, it's in this depression and discouragement that Jacob finds himself on the second day in the evening at a place called Luz, L-U-Z. And he's tired and he's discouraged. And he decides to lie down to sleep in this strange place, all alone, off the beaten track, in danger from his brother, possibly in danger from robbers, certainly in danger from wild animals, and he lays down to sleep. There's something really interesting here. He chooses an interesting way to sleep. Singer-songwriter named Michael Card, some of you might have heard of Michael Card. He wrote a song about Jacob named Asleep on Holy Ground. And the first few words of the song are, a stone for a pillow as hard as his head. I like that. It's an apt description. I mean, how could you sleep with a stone for a pillow? Well, if your head's as hard as a stone, it doesn't hurt, right? So he lies down, and it actually says he took a stone for a pillow and he slept. But Michael Card's song says he slept on holy ground. So while he was sleeping, he has this dream. Pick up the story in verse 12 of Genesis 28. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. The word ladder could also be translated stairway or stairs. And in my thinking, it's a staircase or a stairway. Why? Because when I was in kindergarten class, as a little boy, about that big, we always had memory verse rolls. Some of you know what I'm talking about. There's big rolls that every week you would put another page back and you'd expose another picture. And I remember this picture from my kindergarten class of this memory verse roll, the picture of Jacob sleeping on a rock and the stairway to heaven. I remember it very, very well. So in my mind, that's what it'll always be. That's exactly what it is. So he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder or a stairway set up to earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending. Jacob was not alone. Satan was there to press his temptations and his accusations. But who else was there? Angels were also there. And I think it's cool that angels are going up to heaven and they're coming down. Now, if they were only going up to heaven, would that be good news? No, I don't think so. They're deserting me. But they're coming down. So there's two-way communication between heaven and earth. The angels are going up to tell God the condition on earth, the situation. And God is commissioning and he's sending angels down the stairway to come and help people. I think that's a beautiful picture. It's wonderful, good news. God's sending angels back down. And so he sees this stairway to heaven. And there are these angels ascending and descending. Do you think that was comforting? Absolutely. But that's not the best part. The best part comes next. Verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it. The ladder to heaven, Jacob's ladder. But God is at the top. And he says these words. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Behold, listen to this. I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. You worrying about Esau? Don't worry about Esau. I'm tougher than Esau. I can protect you. And then he says, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, this is an incredible promise. Do you pick up what this promise is? This is the exact same promise that God gave to Abraham back in Genesis 13. This is the exact same promise God had given to Isaac in Genesis 26. And now this promise is passed down to the liar, Jacob. The same promise. God promises that he will always be with him. He will not forsake him. Perhaps what Jacob says in the next verse is one of the greatest understatements of the Bible. Verse 16. Chapter 28, verse 16. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place. Think so? And then I love what he says. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. Have you ever been to that place? Where you think you're alone. You think everything's falling down on your head. You can't see past the ceiling. You think your prayers aren't getting past the ceiling. You ever been to that place? Jacob says, there's no way God is in this place. But then he awakens to the fact that surely the Lord is in this place and I did not know it. What a wonderful thing when you don't know he's there to realize that he's there. He promises that he will be there. He will never leave you, just like he promised Jacob that. He promises you today he will never leave you, he will never forsake you. He will always be with you. Even when you don't feel like He's there, He's there. And Jacob is learning these things. He continues on. 17. And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place?" Another understatement. "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And so what does he get up? What does he do? He gets up. He finds the pillow that he's been sleeping on. He sets it up as a monument, as an altar. And he pours oil over it to sanctify it. And it becomes a special place to him. The place where he met God. And I've got to think that he must have come back here later on in his life. It doesn't really say that, but I think he did. Came back to this place and saw that pillow he'd been sleeping on, that rock. And he named the place Bethel, which means, Beth means house, of El, God. So that's why it's Bethel. And we know where Bethel is today. In the Holy Land. It's the place where Jacob met God. It's a special place. It was time for Jacob, the liar, to take the next step with God. And so God revealed the stairway to heaven, the ladder, Jacob's ladder. He revealed it to him so Jacob could start taking steps of faith and trust in God. Now, there's a very interesting, as far as I know, the only reference in the whole rest of Scripture to this story. A very interesting reference in the New Testament, the book of John. It tells us the real meaning of this story. It gives us the insight into the symbolism of the story. It's in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 51. The story is here that Jesus is calling disciples. He's called Philip to be his disciple. Philip goes and calls another fellow who's Nathanael and says, "I found the Messiah." And so Nathanael comes. Nathanael's under a fig tree, the traditional place for prayer in the New Testament. And typically they would pray under a fig tree, praying for the Messiah. And so think about this picture. Philip is under the fig tree praying for the Messiah. Nathanael's under the fig tree praying for the Messiah, and Philip comes along and says, "I found the guy." So Nathanael goes along. He says, remember, this is when he says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" But he comes along. So he sees Jesus, verse 48. Nathanael says to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answers him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you now believe? You shall see greater things than these." And he said to him, and this is the application, "Truly I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on Jacob's ladder, the Son of God." Jesus is Jacob's ladder. Jesus is the connection between heaven and earth. He's the one. And so Jacob sees the symbol thousands of years before. He doesn't understand it's pointing to Jesus, but it is. It's pointing to Jesus. In the book Desire of Ages, we have this interesting application. It says, "Christ is the ladder that Jacob saw, the base resting on earth and the topmost round, reaching to the gate of heaven, to the very threshold of glory." And then listen. It says, "If that ladder had failed by a single step of reaching the earth, we should have been lost." I think this is interesting because if I'd have been writing this, I would have said, if the ladder by a single step failed to reach heaven. That's not what it says, though. Did you see? If this ladder, by a single step, had failed to reach the earth, because the ladder is being built from heaven to earth, not from earth to heaven. If it had simply failed to reach the earth, we should have been lost. But Christ reaches us where we are. He reaches down for us. He is the way we get to heaven. It's through Him and Him alone that we can reach heaven. And this is what Nathanael needed to know. And so Nathanael, Jesus says, Nathanael, it's time for you to take the next step toward me. I am Jacob's ladder. We sang the old song at the beginning of the service. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. What does it mean? For the slaves who originally wrote this song, there's some suggestion that it could have had something to do with them wanting freedom, and there's some speculation that it actually had to do with how they could find the Underground Railroad. Some suggestion of that, but on a spiritual basis, what does it mean? It just simply means that Jesus is our means of salvation. Jesus is saving us. That's what it means. When we are climbing Jacob's ladder, we're coming closer and closer to heaven through Jesus. And then the second verse says, every round goes higher, higher. What's it mean? It means growing in Jesus. We're drawing closer to Him. Our commitment to Him is getting stronger. Is yours? When you sing this song, is that what it means to you? I'm afraid that this song could make us, like Jacob, a liar. Are you truly, when you sing the song, every round goes higher, higher? Or should you be singing the song, every round goes lower, lower? How about your relationship with Jesus today? Are you drawing closer to Him, or are you going the other direction? Because you can go both directions on the ladder. If you're not going anywhere, if you just think you're standing still at one place, you are stuck. Like I was stuck on the roof. You're stuck. And Jesus doesn't want us to be stuck. He wants us to be growing. Are you growing? Are you climbing? In your life, does every year, does every round go higher and higher? Are you getting closer to Jesus today than you were last year? Are you climbing Jacob's ladder? You know, there are three alternatives in our Christian life. One is growing in Jesus. One is growing in Satan. Now, some of you will say that's the only two. No, there's a third one. Growing in Jesus, growing in Satan, or growing in self-deception that you think you're growing in Jesus when you're really growing in Satan. Revelation talks about that in Revelation chapter 3. It's called the Laodicean condition. You say you're rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing. But don't you know, Jesus says you're really poor and miserable and blind and naked. There are three alternatives. And I've seen some people who were very heavily into self-deception. There are three alternatives. Is it time for you to take the next step? I challenge you in your spiritual life to take the next step. Don't be stuck. Take the next step, drawing closer to Jesus. Now, this would mean something different for every single one of you because none of us are in the exact same place. But what does it mean to take the next step? Perhaps in your life, you need to take the next step through your devotional life. Maybe you need to spend more time in devotions, more time in prayer, more time in seeking God, more time in studying His Word. Take the next step. Maybe that's okay in your life. But if it's not, Take the next step. Draw closer to Jesus. Perhaps the next step for you would be something to do with service. Sometimes I think about my own life. And my life's a little different because of the work that I do. But sometimes I realize how much time I spend for me and how little time I spend for other people. Think about that for your life. How much time do you spend on your stuff? And how much time do you spend on somebody else's? Now, I know some of you are going to say, oh, don't put me on a guilt trip, preacher. I'm already overwhelmed. I can't do anything else. Well, maybe the Lord wants you to take that next step. Perhaps in service to others. Look for needs around you. Volunteer for something. We have a wonderful Adventist Community Services program downtown. They would love to have more volunteers. They don't have enough volunteers. Can I say this? I can say this, I think. They'd especially like to have volunteers who are younger than 70 or 65. Believe me, they would. Perhaps there are lots of places outside the church to volunteer. I personally think that hospice is one of the most wonderful organizations today. Hospice provides help and care in times when people are at their very lowest and the greatest need. Even an hour or 2 hours a week, somebody, if you're willing, somebody could use an opportunity just to get away from their loved one who they're caring for. Perhaps you could be, they call it respite care. All you have to do is go sit with the person for an hour while the other person runs errands or goes out to dinner, just relaxes for a few minutes, or goes to the drugstore. Or what a wonderful opportunity. Perhaps taking for you the next step would be to find a place to serve other people in a way like Jesus would have. Perhaps you need to take the next step of sharing your faith. There are people around us, all around us, who don't know Jesus, who don't know that Jesus is coming back again. And I'll just bet, can I say that word from the pulpit? Bet? I can say that. That if you pray for God to lead you to someone to share your faith with, He'll do it. If you really are willing. We have tons of literature around. If you're a little bit shy about actually speaking, let the literature do the speaking for you. Perhaps that's your next step you need to take. Or perhaps you need to take the next step in your commitment of your finances to Jesus. We have many people who are very faithful in giving tithes to the Williamsport church. But all the tithe that comes to the Williamsport church goes out of the Williamsport church except for my salary, and Candace's salary comes back. Our tithe last year was $797,000. Isn't that right, Frank? Candace's salary and mine, you understand, not $797,000. You understand that, right? Our tithe leaves the church and goes to help all the way around the world. We also have needs in the local church. That's why we have church offerings. Some of you give to the tithe because you feel required to do that. But God says in Malachi to give tithes and offerings. Perhaps the next step for you would be to start giving offerings in addition to your tithe. I'm amazed sometimes that some of our senior members give double tithe. They give 10% to offering and 10% to tithe. I don't know how they do it, but I'm really appreciative of the fact that they do. Why am I saying that this is the next step? Because tithe and offerings are not about money. It's about spiritual commitment. The money is not what it's all about. It's about where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Perhaps that's the next step. Or perhaps the next step is just simply church involvement. Now, I understand that I'm talking to the wrong people because you're here. But we have many church members who never attend church. Their next step is they need to start attending church. Perhaps you're faithful every week in church. What's your next step? Maybe it's attending Wednesday night prayer meeting, or we have our small accord groups that are being a real blessing to people. Perhaps that's your next step. Or perhaps your next step is not just to come to church and be a spectator, but to be a participant, to be ministering on Sabbath morning. I don't know what your next step is, and I'm not going to try to tell you. I'm just giving you some ideas. But be praying for the Holy Spirit to lead you into what the next step is. If we don't take the next step, we're stuck. And so God wants us to continually be climbing this ladder so we're closer and closer to Him, climbing higher and higher. We're going to close by singing